I've been thinking about the aftermath of colonialism. There's various things going off at the moment that they can be brought together into one topic. I think and have a discussion on that.
Okay, why colonialism?
Colonialism really starts in the 16th century from Europe, well, that colonialism anyway. There were other colonialisms before that, but that's the one that exercises people's minds at the moment. And it really began with the improvements in navigation. Before that, mariners didn't know where they were altogether, so they couldn't travel very far from the coast. But once from the 17th century onwards, they travelled all the way, first of all, down the west coast of Africa. They could start the transatlantic slave trade.
Okay, so it started because of the navigation getting better, do you think?
Yeah, and the Africans were actually taking each other as slaves, and
Okay,
long
so it
before
didn't
the
start because of navigation.
That's right.
Yeah.
There was lots of slave taking on the east coast from the because the Arabs were very good sailors.
So how does that play into reparations then, if we're talking about reparations, which I guess we're going to talk about, aren't we? If there was slavery before the so-called colonial, because the colonialism is kind of saying you are the worst slave traders or you're the only slave traders, so you must pay back. That's the reparations narrative, isn't it? You're saying there was much more slavery before that, yeah?
It's still going on. It was going on well into the 20th century.
Chattel slavery, real where they have to tie people up and stop them running away to make them
Yeah,
work.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, where's
yeah.
that happening then?
Well, they went to Saudi Arabia.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm asking about what's you're saying there's chattel slavery already today. Are you saying that's happening still?
Well, it's sort of below the surface, but it probably is. But I don't want to discuss that.
Okay.
I'd rather point out that slavery didn't begin with the Europeans
Okay.
taking place from the west coast of Africa. They tapped into an established trade, so to speak, trade
Yeah.
in people.
Yeah.
But they used to have wars and sell each other and capture
Yeah.
each
Yeah.
other's men and sell each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah. Everybody's done that, and that was a standard practice, wasn't it?
The ones that went to Saudi Arabia got castrated, so they didn't have many descendants. Whereas the ones who went to America,
Yeah.
uh, they 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 were allowed to breed, which was the topic of the famous remark by David Starkey, which got him sacked from the university in
Ah,
Cambridge.
that's what got him sacked, was it, and cancelled? What did he say?
If there was genocide against the Negroes, there wouldn't be so many damn blacks, which was tactless.
Yeah, bit silly.
But the West seems to have more of a guilty conscience.
Yeah, I don't understand that. I don't agree with that because I don't understand it. I know you talk about it a lot. You know, I think it's more than that. I think the West is not guilty. I think there's something more to it than that. But anyway, that's not for today.
Go on, what do you think it is?
I think people whose egos have control of them see that saving the planet will be good.
Ah,
So they look to see who's become potentially who can be labeled as a victim and then exploit them.
you mean virtual, sort of subject to do some virtue signaling
Yeah,
over.
well, I mean, virtue signaling is too superficial a way of looking at it, much deeper than that. Because the ego is controlling the minds of the flattery, the self-flattery in the ego helps those people find victims to be seen to be saving by. I mean, climate change is another example of this, but we don't want to talk about that now. A God thing, really, because they want to be seen by God, even if they're atheists. They want to be seen by God to be saving the world, because then they will be saved in heaven. You see, even if they're atheists, they would never admit that. But that's really what the ego is doing, I think. But anyway,
I mean, we've drifted into actually what's the more important area. Why are people
yeah,
doing this at all?
yeah, yeah. I think that's the only way. It's the only way, even though I don't believe it, I'm saying it, I don't necessarily believe it, but there's not any better explanation for it. I think, feeling guilty is just too shallow. It's just too easy to say that. People aren't that stupid, you know. Even
Yeah,
stupid people aren't that stupid, you know.
I think that's right. But even within those terms, it makes no sense because
Okay.
if you take South Africa, I'll put up some pictures as we talk. But my grandparents lived in South Africa for a while, and my grandfather went out in 1891, and he came back and married, and they had a very good life in South Africa. But he worked hard, and uh, they went to Johannesburg, which was then part of the Boer Republic under President Kruger. He didn't like the influx of all the British because they'd had trouble with the British before, which was why the Boer Republics were set up. The Boer Republic started when the British came to Cape Town, and that was sort of around the early 19th century, and they didn't like the fact that the Boers kept slaves on their farms. So there was, when slavery ended in 1830, in the 1830s, the Boers were forbidden to keep slaves. So they migrated in what was called Great Trek, and they set up the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. But the Transvaal was where the gold and diamonds was discovered, and the British came to exploit that. The Boers thought it was a catastrophe that there were all these minerals under their farmland. And then the Boer War broke out, which was partly the British. I think the British were the instigators, but there were all sorts of issues around that. The product of that was eventually the setting up of the South African Republic in 1910, and they imposed severe restrictions on blacks owning land, and generally they were treated as second-class citizens, and that was apartheid, and that eventually was ended with pressure from mainly the African National Congress. And unfortunately, the African National Congress was a Marxist-inspired organization, which well, it needn't have been, but when they got power in 1995, with the ending of apartheid, they went off and did the Marxist things and the
I mean,
latest.
I remember Winnie Mandela, and she was in the news a lot because it was so entertaining watching her wreck the place, wrecking stuff under the wing, under the arm of Nelson Mandela himself, her husband.
Yeah,
She was going around wrecking everything against his wishes. And that's what Marxists do, isn't it? They're wreckers. They wreck stuff.
yeah,
We've seen this recently with the woke stuff. It's wrecking. It's a wrecking institution. Don't know why. I don't know why. It's like when I was at school, when we knew we couldn't beat the team that was coming in to play us at rugby, we used to just wreck the game because it was the best we would get away with. Do you know what I mean? We knew we weren't going to win, so we'd just wreck it. I know it's ridiculous, but that's what the team did, you see. But I see this in a lot in socialism and the left. They don't care about the harm that they have to do if they can't win. And we're seeing this in America now after the new administration's got in. They don't care what they have to do to wreck it.
yeah.
Mm.
What they're doing now, I'm not quite sure of the details, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
The worst portrayal of it is that they're confiscating white farmers' land, which is what happened in
that's what the
Zimbabwe.
white farmers did, though, isn't it? They confiscated the land, didn't they? I'm not saying it's justifying it. I'm not saying it's tit for tat, but that's what happened, isn't it?
Don't think it was farmland. They enclosed land that had been used for grazing, but there's been a series of migrations from the south as well. So
Yeah.
the present day majority black population are also migrants who came in roughly
Okay.
around the same time, because the original black population were the Bushmen who were
Okay.
pushed out to the margins.
Oh,
Aborigines, yeah. But the whites enclosed the land and squeezed out the blacks.
yeah. Well, that was a mistake in its
Um,
own right, wasn't it? But that's another
Not right.
matter. That's not a colonialism or a race matter, is it? That is just people, isn't it?
That's just people, yeah. But they were efficient farmers because the climate's pretty good for a lot of things. So that,
Logical advantage they had, though, isn't it, over the
yeah,
Aborigines? Yeah.
and guns.
Yeah. What technology?
With the ending of apartheid, they could have said, "Well, we'll let you stay, but you pay us the value of the land, you pay us the rental value of the land,
Yeah.
and you keep your privileges, but you pay for the privilege, every last bit of it." or most of it anyway.
Who would say they should pay for it?
People who occupy land, if you believe in George's principles, but they go back a lot further, people who occupy land should pay for the privilege, their secure tenure.
Who to, though?
Government.
There wasn't a government, was there? Because the land was free, largely, in South Africa.
It was free then, but in 1995 there was a government, and they could have just turned around and said to everybody, just pay us the rent and we'll let you stay.
The new government, you mean? Yeah.
The new apartheid government, yeah.
Well, I mean, we saw what happened in Russia, didn't we, in 1917?
Yeah.
They didn't do that, did they? They could have said that, and the Soviets could have said that, couldn't they?
Yeah, exactly.
Some of them were saying it.
What should have happened was, and there was a tradition of it in South Africa as well. There'd been a property tax in South Africa, British style, which was a tax on land and buildings, and they could have converted that to a tax on buildings, got rid of all the other taxes gradually. Colourblind policy, that's what they need in South Africa. And then so black people who wanted to farm could do it as long as they paid the rent. But the land doesn't care what colour the people own it are.
Yeah, it just treats them as humans.
Yeah, that was all this could have been solved quite peacefully and amicably. Most of the blacks in South Africa have not done very well at all, which is disgraceful because South Africa's not only got land value, it's got gold, silver, platinum, other platinum group metals, diamonds, and all the rest of it. So,
why not? It's not because of their race. We've got to not to talk about that.
No, but it's companies like De Beers. But if these mining companies were made to pay the resource rent and compete for it periodically with some kind of auction scheme, the government would have oodles of money. They wouldn't need to have any other taxes. The Marxism blinds them to what's possible.
Don't you mean Marxism fills their pockets?
And they can, well, a bit of both. They can fill their pockets too, or fill their buddies' pockets.
They're capitalists, really. They're capitalists masquerading as Marxists. Anyway.
Well, they always are, aren't they?
Yeah, true. Okay.
Let's move on to another place where land's been nationalised, Burkina Faso. Now, I'm not quite sure what the details of that are, but again, it doesn't really matter because land titles always come from a government anyway. The land in England is owned by the king nominally, and it's held. It's not actually owned.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So very, very good fundamental point, that which most people are completely unaware of, especially the professors of economics.
But if the Burkina Faso then insists that the land rent is paid, they've effectively got the land value tax. And that should do them pretty well. I don't know, Burkina Faso is very poor unless they've discovered some minerals which are worthwhile, which they might have done. But that's not the point either, really. The point is that having nationalised the rent, they need to collect the land value, and that's all they do need to do.
Not nationalise the rent, confiscated the rent. Confiscated it.
Confiscate, nationalise, charge it as a tax, but don't confiscate their goods and don't confiscate their wages.
Yeah, exactly.
And that brings us to slavery generally, because Burkina Faso is in that part of Africa. It's in the Sahara, isn't it? It is on the slave trading routes.
Okay.
And the slave trading routes were across the Sahara. Mainly the customers were in Saudi Arabia. Africa were used as breeding stock, and they were shipped across the Atlantic. It was the famous three-way trade from the West Coast ports. The trade was done by the native tribes. They traded each other, as I said, and they shipped them across to, originally started with the Spanish to Brazil, and then to the West Indies, and then to...
reparations. Why the Spanish and Portuguese not being called out on reparations?
Maybe they have. We haven't heard about it.
Yeah, okay. This is a commonly heard of in the news as propaganda. I mean, why don't we call out all of these ancient civilizations for reparations?
Time's passed, unfortunately. But again, people today have got to have justice done to them.
That's a good point. What about if we're going to, let's just assume that reparations will be paid. I'm not saying they should be. Let's just assume. What about the current slaves in the world that are suffering, shouldn't we use that money to free those people first?
Well, that would be a better idea, but free them for what?
What?
Free them to what? Because what happened in the United States when the slaves were freed, they got land allocations. I think it was 40 acres or something.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So they were, to some extent, they got a little bit more than just being released and left to wander off and do their own thing. And I think similar things happened in the Caribbean.
And what happened to them? They didn't keep it, did they? Evidently.
I don't, I, I don't know exactly what happened. Obviously, black people do seem to be among the poorer sector of the community in the United States today. And that's something that needs looking at. It's been much discussed. There's somebody called Thomas Sowell. Have you come across Thomas Sowell? Had a lot of broadcasts on that subject. The countries where the descendants of slaves are having a bad time really need to look at the economic opportunities that the people enjoy there, or lack of them. That needs to be addressed. But just giving money from a government to another government is a kind of reverse Robin Hood, because the tax system put in places like Britain is basically soak the poor, and if the money goes to wherever it goes, it'll be snapped up by some elite or others.
We're seeing that with charity, namely the NGOs. But charity, I think, will be part of this, you know. We're seeing it, aren't we?
Yeah.
NGOs are basically a scam, isn't it? A money laundering scam.
So it's a business disguised as a charity.
Yeah.
The poor blacks in the Caribbean aren't going to get anything out of it. That you can be pretty sure.
What is the problem for black people, though? I know black people and they're fine. They do well in business. So why is it why is the question even coming up?
They've been identified as an oppressed group. I think that's said. I think a lot of black people certainly in the 50s and 60s in Britain had a bad time.
Bloody hell, yeah, there was definitely racism then. My God, it was awful. Appalling compared to what it is today. Yeah, so that probably is it, isn't it? They've started from a bad place, so they've got a long road got a large hill to climb to get back on level playing field again, right? Would you say?
I think black people in the 70s, some of them were doing very well and they were well integrated and successful, and others seem to get into all sorts of.
Okay, yeah. Well, we're probably going off at a tangent here that we can't ever get to the end of with our limited knowledge on it. But yeah.
No, but I know that I lived in Stoke Newington when there was a large, almost black, mainly Afro-Caribbean. My neighbours were Afro-Caribbean family, and one of the daughters became a high flyer, and the guys mainly seemed to drift around and never made anything of their lives.
I grew up with a black family, and they tell me now, because he's very successful, this black guy and his brother, but he told me there were, because of the problems when they came over in the 60s, his dad, because we grew up with his dad and everything, was that they did get these problems with race, and they didn't, instead of becoming victims, what they did is they developed their own community gangs, really, to protect themselves. Do you see what I mean? And that's how they survived. And they were proud of that, and they did well with it, you see. They managed to rise above it. Whereas today we're told to play on the victim. They did really well.
It's become quite rewarding to be a victim.
I think that's another question we could talk about otherwise, elsewhere. But my view on this is there's so much wealth in the world today. There's the productivity of the world. I know you might not agree. It's so high. There's just so much stuff that can be produced so easily today that people can sit back and sponge easily and get away with it.
What I see here in Sweden is that there are big barriers for getting into the legal economy. A lot of migrants traditionally would have done self-employed things, but bureaucratic and money barriers, tax and all the rest of it, it means that they might as well stay on welfare. You can't altogether blame them. It's a system problem. But reparations really needs to be addressed in the way that people today should get a fair deal.
Yeah, so rather than paying for the sins of the father, deal with what's happening today, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, deal with what's happening today. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's what the left would say they are doing, isn't it?
Well, they're not. They're robbing the poor to pay
Yeah.
the rich.
Yeah. That's true. You know,
There's
as we said, yeah. So there's no
not
solution then.
really-
Is that what you're saying? There's no solution.
Well, there's a solution, but the left haven't got one.
Yeah. Okay. Have the right got one?
Not really. No,
No.
they say, "Oh, well, stand on your own feet," which
That's a false dichotomy anyway, isn't it? The left and the right. So is there a solution?
it's a soft revolution. That's a matter in people's heads, really.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Every time you talk about, I hear someone talk about land value tax flippantly, I think you don't really understand that a soft revolution is needed. Land value tax is not being done for a very good reason, not a very open quotes, good close quotes reason. There's a very important reason, not necessarily a good reason, that it's not being done. And my view on that is that the people of the world, not the wealthy and the powerful, the people on the whole do not want it for some reason. And I don't know why that is, but it goes to what you're saying. It needs a revolution in the mind or a spiritual revolution to get to beat that one, you know, and that certainly is not happening. I look around me, there's none of that happening at all. That kind of revolution, even with all the religion in the world, is not happening at all. I'm not saying it's going backwards, I just don't see any growth in it.
Land value taxation is a very old idea, but it got a boost in the end of the 19th century when Henry George published Progress and Poverty.
Mm.
And for about probably up to the First World War, in fact, well into the 1930s, it was a focus for a popular movement. It was doable, and in fact, it even got to the point of being in the 1931 budget that they messed it up. They always mess it up.
I understand that we think that it's just a technical problem, but it's not a technical problem.
No,
It's not a policy problem, not a technical problem.
it's eerie that it got messed up.
I think nature itself messed it up, so it couldn't happen. That's my theory on it, because it was the worst alternative under the current conditions. No proof of that, I don't believe it, but I think what better reason could there have been for it not happening than that something much bigger messed this up? I just mean the natural forces on the earth.
Land value tax would have been very easy in 1910 because the British property tax being very simply
Yeah.
changed to a land value tax, would have been dead easy.
Hardly any
Administration.
homeowners today.
Well,
How are you going to do it? How are you going to do it today?
it's much harder because of the homeowners, but now there's generation rent, and generation rent is Marxist, so they want to confiscate, punish the boomers and all the other.
It's like the Marxists again, isn't it? You know, we're really capitalists.
Well, I think it's just going to be a great destruction.
Yes, I agree.
Carry on more present.
Because obviously, if you try and take that away from people, there's going to be a huge amount of resistance, isn't there? You know. So this is what I'm saying. We get back to the spiritual side of things again. It's not a technical problem, is it?
It looks like that's the case.
Hmm.
Spiritual problem we're talking about.
Yeah. I think it always boils down to that in the end. If you talk about anything important and really dig deep and don't stop moving forward when you reach things that are uncomfortable for you, you always end up there with the obvious thing, that we've disconnected ourselves from the world sort of thing and just believe it's all everything's just sensual. There's nothing more than what our senses can detect and what our fingers and hands can grab hold of and take ownership of. We've forgotten that there's more to life than bread. You can't live on bread alone, I think they say, don't they? But we believe you can. We believe you can now. And even Mr. Musk is talking like that too, isn't he? I mean, I actually like the guy, but I'm thinking, no, I don't talk like that. It's just like everybody else over the centuries has talked that's failed for the same reasons.